Imagine being invited to a reconciliation feast by your own brother, only to discover that the meat you've been savoring was your own children. This is not fiction. This is the true story of King Atreus of Mycenae, whose revenge against his brother Thyestes became so infamous that it spawned the term Thyestean banquet, a phrase still used today to describe the ultimate betrayal. Welcome to ancient Greece, where family loyalty meant nothing and revenge knew no bounds. This is the story of the House of Atreus, a bloodline so cursed that their crimes would echo through generations, inspiring some of the greatest tragedies ever written. But before we dive into this nightmare, let me warn you, this story contains acts of violence and cannibalism that will disturb you to your core. The House of Atreus was doomed from the very beginning. The curse started with Tantalus, Atreus's grandfather, who committed the unthinkable crime of killing his own son Pelops and serving him to the gods as a test of their omniscience. The gods, horrified by this act, restored Pelops to life and condemned Tantalus to eternal punishment in the underworld. But the damage was done. The family line was forever tainted with a curse that would manifest in each generation through acts of increasingly horrific violence. Pelops, despite being restored to life, could never escape his father's curse. When he grew up and won the hand of Hippodamia in a chariot race through treachery and murder, he only added to the family's bloody legacy. He killed Myrtilus, the charioteer who had helped him cheat, and Myrtilus cursed the entire line of Pelops with his dying breath. This double curse from the gods and from Myrtilus would poison every generation that followed. Pelops had many children, but two would become infamous throughout history: Atreus and Thyestes. From childhood, these brothers were bound by a rivalry so intense it would ultimately tear apart the ancient world. Both were ambitious, both were ruthless, and both were willing to commit any atrocity to claim power. When their half-brother Chrysippus stood in their way to the throne of Olympia, they murdered him together. This fratricidal act forced them into exile, but it also forged a partnership that would soon turn into the deadliest rivalry in ancient history. The brothers fled to Mycenae, one of the most powerful kingdoms in ancient Greece. There, in the absence of King Eurystheus, who was away fighting the Heraclidae, they managed to seize power. But sharing a throne was never going to work for two men whose ambition knew no bounds. The question wasn't if they would turn against each other, but when and how brutal the consequences would be. The first crack in their partnership came when Atreus married Arope, a beautiful Cretan princess. She was supposed to be the perfect royal wife, noble, beautiful, and fertile. But Arope had secrets that would ignite the flames of the brothers' rivalry. Behind Atreus's back, she began a passionate affair with Thyestes. This wasn't just adultery. It was the ultimate betrayal, mixing personal humiliation with political treachery. When Atreus discovered the affair, his rage was beyond description. He had been publicly humiliated by his own brother and wife. In ancient Greece, a man's honor was everything, and both Thyestes and Arope had destroyed his completely. But Atreus was not the type of man to simply divorce his wife or challenge his brother to combat. No, his mind immediately turned to revenge, and the revenge he planned would be so horrific that it would haunt the world for millennia. Atreus's first move was to banish Thyestes from Mycenae. He stripped his brother of all titles and honors, seized his property, and declared him an enemy of the state. Thyestes was forced to flee with his children, becoming a wandering exile. For most men, this would have been revenge enough. But for Atreus, this was only the beginning. The humiliation of exile was nothing compared to what he really had in mind. For months, Atreus plotted in secret. He needed Thyestes to return to Mycenae, and he needed him to come willingly. So Atreus began to spread word that he regretted the banishment, that he missed his brother, and that he wanted to make peace. He sent messengers to Thyestes with tearful apologies and invitations to return home. He spoke of family bonds, of the need for brothers to stand together, of forgiveness and reconciliation. Thyestes, living in poverty and exile, was desperate to believe his brother's words. His children were suffering, he had no kingdom, no power, no future. When Atreus's messengers arrived with promises of forgiveness and restoration, Thyestes saw it as his salvation. He convinced himself that Atreus had genuinely forgiven him, that blood truly was thicker than water, and that his brother's love had overcome his anger. The return to Mycenae was orchestrated like a royal triumph. Atreus met Thyestes at the gates of the city with embraces and tears of joy. He publicly proclaimed his brother's return, announced his forgiveness, and declared that all past grievances were forgotten. The people of Mycenae, who had watched the brothers' rivalry with fear, rejoiced at what seemed to be genuine reconciliation. Atreus planned a magnificent feast to celebrate Thyestes' return. The royal palace was decorated with the finest tapestries. The halls were filled with flowers, and the kitchens prepared for days. This would be no ordinary banquet. This would be a celebration of family unity, a demonstration of royal power, and a feast that would be remembered forever, though not for the reasons the guests expected. While the preparations continued, Atreus set his real plan in motion. Thyestes had returned with his children, 3 sons who represented both his legacy and his future. These children were everything to Thyestes, his pride, his hope, his reason for living. And they were exactly what Atreus needed for his revenge. One by one, using various pretexts, Atreus separated the children from their father. He sent them on errands, invited them to private meetings, offered them tours of the palace. Each child trusted their uncle completely. After all, the family had reconciled, hadn't they? They had no reason to fear the man who had welcomed them back with such apparent warmth. What happened next was so horrific that ancient writers could barely bring themselves to describe it. In the deepest cellars of the palace, Atreus murdered Thyestes' 3 sons. But murder was not enough for his revenge. He had something far more twisted in mind. He dismembered the bodies, carefully separating the meat from the bones. Then he took this human flesh to the royal kitchens and personally oversaw its preparation. The royal cooks, unaware of what they were preparing, seasoned and roasted the meat according to Atreus's specific instructions. He wanted everything to be perfect, the taste, the presentation, the aroma. This had to be the most magnificent meal ever served in the palace of Mycenae. The irony was beyond cruel. Atreus was using all his royal resources, all his wealth and power, to create a feast that would destroy his brother's soul. As the sun set on the day of the great reconciliation feast, the noble guests began to arrive. The great hall of Mycenae had never looked more magnificent. Golden cups gleamed on the tables, the finest wines flowed freely, and the air was filled with music and laughter. Thyestes, dressed in his finest robes and seated at his brother's right hand, felt that he had truly come home. Atreus played the perfect host. He toasted his brother's return, spoke movingly of family loyalty, and personally served Thyestes the choicest portions of meat. He watched with satisfaction as his brother ate with obvious pleasure, complimenting the exceptional flavor and tenderness of the feast. Every bite that Thyestes took fed Atreus's sense of triumph. But as the feast continued, Thyestes began to notice something troubling. Where were his children? He had expected them to join the banquet, to be presented to the court, to share in this moment of family triumph. When he asked Atreus about their absence, his brother simply smiled and told him not to worry. They would appear soon enough. As the evening progressed and wine loosened tongues, Atreus decided the moment had come for his revelation. He stood before the assembled court, called for silence, and began to speak. He talked about justice, about punishment, about the consequences of betrayal. He spoke of adultery and treachery, of broken vows and family honor. The guests listened in growing confusion and horror as they realized this was not a speech of reconciliation. Then Atreus gave the signal. Servants entered the hall carrying covered platters. But instead of more food, these platters contained the heads and hands of Thyestes' 3 sons, the only parts of the children that Atreus had not cooked and served. The revelation hit the hall like a thunderbolt. The guests recoiled in horror as they realized what they had witnessed, what they had potentially consumed. Thyestes' reaction was beyond human description. The man who had just been celebrating his return, who had been praising the delicious meal, who had been toasting his brother's forgiveness, suddenly understood the full scope of Atreus' revenge. He had not just eaten meat, he had consumed his own children, his own blood, his own future. The realization broke something fundamental in his mind. Atreus watched his brother's agony with cold satisfaction. This was the revenge he had dreamed of, not just murder, not just exile, but the complete destruction of Thyestes' humanity. He had forced his brother to become a cannibal, to unknowingly participate in his own children's desecration. It was a revenge so perfect, so utterly devastating, that even Atreus himself seemed awed by what he had accomplished. The court of Mycenae erupted in chaos. Guests fled in terror, servants collapsed in horror, and even hardened warriors wept at what they had witnessed. This was not just murder. This was an act so far beyond normal human evil that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of civilization. The Thyestean banquet, as it would come to be known, became the ultimate example of human depravity. Thyestes, broken beyond repair, cursed his brother and the entire house of Atreus with his dying words. He prophesied that this act of ultimate evil would poison every generation, that the children and grandchildren would pay for Atreus' crime with their own blood. Then he fled Mycenae forever, taking with him only his daughter Pelopia and the terrible knowledge of what he had unknowingly done. But the curse of the Thyestean banquet was just beginning to work its poison through the bloodline. Thyestes, driven mad by his desire for revenge, consulted an oracle who told him that only a son born from his own daughter could avenge his murdered children. In his insanity, Thyestes raped Pelopia, who gave birth to Aegisthus, a child conceived in violence and destined for revenge. Aegisthus grew up knowing his true parentage and his purpose. When Atreus' son Agamemnon became king and left to fight in the Trojan War, Aegisthus saw his opportunity. He seduced Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra, and together they murdered the returning king, continuing the cycle of vengeance that the Thyestean banquet had begun. The ripple effects of Atreus' revenge continued for generations. Agamemnon's children, Orestes and Electra, eventually murdered their mother Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. Each act of vengeance spawned another, each murder demanded another murder, all tracing back to that horrific night when a brother served human flesh to his sibling and called it justice. The story of the Thyestean banquet became one of the foundational myths of Western literature. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides all wrote tragedies based on the cursed house of Atreus. Seneca created a Roman adaptation that influenced Shakespeare and other Renaissance dramatists. The tale has been retold countless times because it represents something fundamental about human nature: our capacity for both love and hatred, our ability to justify any atrocity in the name of justice. Modern psychologists have studied the story as an extreme example of narcissistic rage and familial destruction. The Thyestean banquet represents the ultimate breakdown of social bonds, the moment when civilization gives way to something far more primitive and terrifying. It shows how personal betrayal can escalate into acts of such magnitude that they poison entire civilizations. What makes the story even more chilling is how calculated Atrus's revenge was. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of madness. It was a carefully planned atrocity that required months of preparation and an almost supernatural level of cold-blooded determination. Atrus had to murder 3 innocent children, dismember their bodies, cook their flesh, and then watch his brother eat them while maintaining perfect composure. The level of psychological control required for such an act suggests a form of evil that goes beyond normal human understanding. The ancient Greeks saw the house of Atrus as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the terrible price of revenge. They understood that some acts are so heinous they can never be forgiven or forgotten, that they create cycles of violence that can destroy entire civilizations. The Thyestean banquet became their ultimate example of how personal evil can have cosmic consequences. Today, more than 2,000 years later, we still use the term Thyestean banquet to describe acts of ultimate betrayal and revenge. The story has lost none of its power to shock and horrify because it touches something fundamental about human nature. We recognize in Atrus the capacity for evil that exists within all of us, the potential for hatred to overcome every moral boundary. The house of Atrus eventually fell, destroyed by the very curses and cycles of violence that began with that terrible feast. But the story lives on as a testament to the darkest capabilities of human nature, a reminder that even the bonds of family can be twisted into instruments of ultimate destruction. In the end, Atrus got his revenge, but the price was not just his brother's sanity, but the soul of his entire bloodline. This is the legacy of the Thyestean banquet, not just a story of ancient Greece, but a timeless warning about the terrible consequences of revenge taken too far. It reminds us that some victories are so costly they become indistinguishable from defeat, and that some acts of revenge are so terrible they destroy not just the victim, but the perpetrator and everyone around them. The next time you sit down to a family dinner, remember the house of Atrus. Remember that the greatest horrors in human history have often come not from strangers, but from those we trust most. And remember that in the pursuit of perfect revenge, we risk becoming monsters far worse than those we seek to punish.